Howdy everyone! For today's Jolly Lark, we're going to be painting up some of these terrific new Werewarg models from Parabellum Games. They were kind enough to send me these models to paint, so thanks for that. And we're going to get these painted up pretty quickly today, about 2 hours start to finish. Obviously the video is not that long, it's edited down to show you all the steps. But about 2 hours start to finish to get these painted up and ready for some battles in the Last Argument of Kings game, or First Blood. So the models are usable for both of those and are just really cool, dynamic, characterful werewolf models too. Now, there's lots of different ways to speed up painting a model. Often we call that speed painting anytime you're using a technique that's aimed at painting it a little bit faster. In this case, I'm going to show you something that I do sometimes, which is finishing the whole model in one color. In this case, we're going to finish the whole model in different shades of brown, which is going to be the final color of all of the cloth bits on the model. And then we're going to tint that kind of multiple shades of brown. We're going to then tint those shades of brown with some translucent contrast and express colors to shift the brown finished areas into other colors. Does that make sense? Well, follow along and you'll see what I'm talking about. So we're basically going to start off by dry brushing the entire model with Pro-Acryl Dark Umber. So this is going to give it an all-over coat of dark brown. And I've got a little bit of water dripped onto my paper towel there. Important to use shop towels that don't have lint. So with a little bit of brown on the brush and a short bristled brush, this is going to be getting this dark brown pretty well all over the model, but still leaving a little bit of black in the cracks and crevices. But I'm not even so worried about that. If you cover up all the black, that's fine too. The dark brown is really the base coat. Now, I sat down to paint a full unit of 3 models. That's a full unit in the game, because I wanted these to be game playable. But I'm just going to show you step by step on this one model. But you might occasionally see one of the other 2 werewolf models sneak into the frame. So after you've got a good solid coat of dark brown, the dark umber, and then I'm going to switch to the Pro-Acryl Light Umber. And as always with dry brushing, you're generally going a little lighter with each lighter color. So the darkest color gets the most paint on there, literally pressing harder with the bristles, getting more paint on the model. And then as you go lighter and lighter, you're pressing on the model a little less hard, you're putting a little less paint on the brush. But this is an all-over dry brush of the light umber. Before we call the brown base coating done, we're going to go one more lighter still. So at the end of this, you'll have black, dark brown, lightest brown. So 4 different colors, if you include the black, on the model, which will give a really nice variation of colors, shades, and highlights all over the model. So let's grab our werewolf number 1 here again. And you can kind of see that the bone color, the Pro-Acryl Bone, it's actually a little bit darker on the paper towel than it is straight out of the bottle because it's mixing with some of the browns that are still wet on the brush, and that's fine. You can test on the base to make sure that you've got the right amount of paint on the brush. That textured top of the base is a nice testing ground to make sure you don't have too much paint on the brush for the final layer. Now, for the previous 2 browns, I was kind of doing them all over, kind of just getting them everywhere. For this final brightest layer, I'm just kind of going up and down with the brush on the sides of the model, and I'll end up going kind of across the top of the model as well. And it's a little bit hard to see in the video, but I'm only hitting the model with the downstroke. And what that's doing is helping to simulate light coming from above. So just a quick dry brush coming down, hitting the model on the downstroke with this lightest brown, and that's going to really make all the different textures and muscles and shapes of this model really pop. This is a fun stage of painting because you really see all the sculpted detail on the model come out in sharp relief. At this point, the whole model, it kind of looks the same all over, but actually the cloth is pretty much done. We're not going to do much else to the cloth from now until the very end of the paint job. So essentially, it really does speed things up. But what we are going to do before we start adding any translucent colors like contrast paints or express paints, we're going to add a little bit of white to some areas of the model that are not going to stay brown. So the teeth, the face, the claws, stuff like that. And adding a little bit of white now will make those translucent colors pop just a bit more when they go on later. So let's zoom in on the claws here, and I'll show you in a little bit more detail what I'm doing. So for example, the claws, I want them to pop a little more. I'm not totally obscuring the brown layer, but I'm adding some pretty bold white stripes that start at the base of the nail and then converge at the point. Now for the fur, well, not the fur, but the skin, I want the skin to look a little furrier, not just be smooth. I think you could go a lot of different ways when painting these. I think it might be interesting to try to paint the smooth skin areas a little bit like skin. Maybe look a little more like a mutant monstrosity, but I wanted these skin areas to look a little hairier. So I'm just going to go in and putting just real fast, pretty loose, some little stripe, little tiny dashes of white on the raised areas of the muscles. And these will sit underneath a translucent layer of paint that we'll add in a minute and give the smooth skin area a little more of like a lightly furred appearance. So here's side by side, here's two of the werewolves. The one on the left has had all of some white highlights added to the skin, to the teeth, to the nails, and the one on the right is where we started with before. That's just the brown layer. So that's all you're going for. This is not a lot. It doesn't take that long. Just some little white under highlights before we move on to adding the additional colors. So the first color we're going to add is some of the Citadel Ratling Grime. And as always, I'll put a full list of colors, or as I always try to do anyway, I'll put a full list of colors down in the comments below. Rattling Grime is a nice kind of natural black. It's not pure black. It has a little more browns in it. Just kind of, I think it fits a little bit better fits better with a natural sort of miniature, the skin and bone and flesh and cloth and that sort of thing. I've mixed it about 1-to-1 with the Citadel Contrast medium. And I'm just putting a thin coat of it on all of the skin areas to darken them up just a little bit. And this is not an all over thick, heavy contrast coat. This is basically trying to get as thin a coat as you can over the whole area so that you're maintaining the coloration that you've created with the dry brushes of brown and the white highlights earlier. You can do a similar thing on all of the leather straps on the model by putting a thin layer of the Citadel Contrast Snakebite Leather on all of the leather straps. And these work great. I actually didn't add any white highlights to these. The Snakebite Leather works well over the brown underpainting. I'm going to rapid fire through these next couple of colors because it's pretty straightforward and it's just putting a thin layer of a translucent paint over some of the different areas of the model. So I'll kind of go through these pretty quickly and then move on to some other steps. So here, putting a little bit of Fyreslayers Flesh onto the face and the ears and the hands of the model to give them a little bit of a fleshier look as if they're a transformed werewolf, not just a beast. Next up is some Citadel Contrast Aggros Dunes on the nails and the teeth. It's a similar color to Snakebite Leather, but a little lighter, a little more yellow. And I think it works well for kind of feral, savage teeth and claws. So with those colors done, we're then going to move on to adding some color to the actual furry bits. So I've got some Pro-Acryl Light Warm Gray and a much, much smaller brush than we used for the initial dry brushing. And I'm using this smaller dry brush because I want to make sure I'm just dry brushing the actual furry bits. And I'm going to try to not get any of this on the rags, on the leather, on the skin, that sort of thing. So just kind of going over the areas of fur lightly. Again, keeping in mind light falls from above. The upwards facing areas of the fur are going to get a little more paint on them. And some of the lower facing areas I may just leave with the dry brushed brown undercoat. Brown works pretty well as a base coat for gray. If there's some brown undertones in the recesses of the gray fur, that looks good. And my plan for this miniature from the beginning at least, was to have a lighter, brighter fur contrasting with some kind of dirty brown rags and then a darker still gray skin. So even though these are being painted pretty quickly, like I said, under 2 hours for all three miniatures, I'm still looking to create some contrast, create some interesting color choices, and to have them look visually interesting on the tabletop. With the fur dry brushing done, I'm going to add a little bit of an orangey brown from the Vallejo Express color. This is the copper brown. I'm going to so it's a little funny. You got a furry werewolf who's then wearing a fur kind of skirt, tabard, loincloth thing. But, you don't want the fur of his loincloth to look like he's wearing his own fur. So I'm going to add a little bit of this reddish brown to his fur loincloth to make it look like he pulled that off of some other beast. And I may, if I end up doing a Nords army for Last Argument of Kings, use this same color for my beast pack, which are more like four-legged beasts. And that would be a nice army connection if the wolves are kind of white, wolfy looking, but it looks like they've taken their loincloths from the four-legged beasties. And what I'm doing here, since this is a little bit larger area of fur and I want to create some highlights and shadows, is I've painted that reddish brown on the whole area, and then I've wiped all the paint, rinsed all the paint off my brush, and used just a damp brush to pull some of the paint off of the raised areas. So next up, I'm going to grab a little dot of the Pro-Acryl Khaki and use that to add a very slight highlight onto the claws. And something to remember with contrast paints or express paints or any translucent paints is that you're not limited to stopping with them. They don't have to be the final step. Often it's the case that a contrast layer will benefit from a small highlight with a traditional opaque paint. So similarly, for the fleshy bits, the ears and the face and the knuckles, I'm just going to grab a little bit of a pinky flesh tone and add that to the tips of the ears, to the ridges on the face, and to the wrinkles on the knuckles. So kind of the brow ridge there. Just going to add a little bit of that light pink flesh tone to some of the face bits. That'll draw attention to the face, which will be interesting, and contrast against the fur, the darker fur that surrounds those areas. After that, I'm going to grab some of the Too Thin Coats green wash. It's kind of a nice muddy green that I think works well for adding a little bit of grime or age to different surfaces. It's pretty thin. It doesn't stain the raised areas of the model that much. So it's good to just grab a thicker brush, and I'm just kind of put some blotches of this on some of the cloth areas of the miniature, kind of some of the trailing edges of the cloth, some of the folds, maybe a little bit in the armpits, behind the knees, parts, that might get sweaty or dirty. So just kind of adding a thin layer of a little bit of grit and dirt onto the werewolf to make him look like he's not really doing his laundry that often. So kind of randomly, there's no particular rhyme or reason here, but just kind of give it a little bit of realistic irregularity to some of the cloth. You can also find when you're using some warm browns as the main colors of a model, or that very warm orangey brown on the loincloth, adding just a little bit of green scattered throughout the model creates some interesting color variations, and the warm browns and green look good together in the same way that red and green look good together. So naturally, I think werewolves should have some bright yellow eyes, so I'm just going to take the same fine brush I used to paint on the white details earlier, just put a dot of my brightest yellow onto each eyeball, and just kind of a little poke. You also could do this with one of the dotting tools that I reviewed in my favorite tools of 2023 video. But just a pointy brush works fine too. These are big models. Conquest is a little bit bigger scale, so these are big models. They've got big eyes. It's not too hard to get in there. So as you can see, I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between areas. I'm now going to grab some of the Citadel Carroburg Crimson for the lips and the tongue, and any scars that are on the face. A couple of them have scars across the face. And bouncing back and forth between different areas of the model gives one thing a little bit of time to dry before moving on to the next step, which can really speed up painting. So, in this example, I highlighted the flesh, but then I went and did something to all the cloth, and now I'm back putting a light wash on the flesh. So that just naturally gives you a little bit of drying time between colors. Super quick next step, I'm just painting a tiny bit of Vallejo Game Color Dark Silver onto a couple little metal bits that are on the miniatures. The wolves have a couple little earrings, and a few of them have like a little metal ring that's holding their ripped up clothes and leather straps together. Again, bouncing back and forth, I'm going to grab a little bit of black and just do a tiny, teeny little dot of black in the middle of each eye. All right, next up is one of my favorite stages. If you've watched some of my other videos, you know this makes an appearance in many of them, is to grab some of the Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a very thin, dark blue shade paint, and just use that to darken up a little bit of the shadows on some of the lower parts of the model. So underneath the legs, kind of in some of the cracks and crevices. And what I'll often do is paint a little bit of it on, rinse my brush out, and then use a little bit of water from just on the damp brush, not like the brush is soaking wet with water, but then just use a little bit of water to spread it out a little bit. So the Drakenhof Nightshade, maybe my single favorite color, and it's just great for darkening the odd recess. Anywhere you think, kind of anywhere that should be a little darker, you just put a little bit of that in the cracks and crevices. And it's pretty good about not leaving watermarks. So you kind of just brush it on where you want it to go and add some shadows back into the areas that you've dry brushed previously. There's really no right or wrong way to do this. Just kind of, you can see here, I'm spinning the model around on the Jolly Lark painting handle. I'll hit up the link in the description if you want to order some for yourself. So it makes you just kind of spin around the model and kind of see if any parts that jump out at you that maybe could be a little bit darker. And it doesn't have to be only the darkest recesses. If you're looking at a big swath of a model's thigh, maybe the lower third of it should be a little darker, even if the whole side of the thigh is facing outwards. It can just help to boost the contrast on the model a little bit. So to further add a little bit of gore and grime and stuff to the model, I'm going to mix up a little bit of Flesh Terror's red contrast paint that I'm just closing up here, a little bit of watered down Flesh Terror's red on my brush, and then I'm just going to take the tip of my finger and just very lightly kind of give a little flick of red onto one or two parts of the model. Not looking for a horror movie here, just a little bit of kind of some red speckles to make it look like there was a fight. So again, not going super light on this. If you didn't look closely, you might not even see it. You could totally skip this step. But just the tiniest, lightest little splatter of red, like on the hands and the face, is a kind of a nice effect on something like this. All right, so getting close to done, I put some texture paste, some Pro-Acryl texture paste, a mixture of the fine and the coarse. I used the new brown color. That's a nice, easy base coat. And then on top of that, I'm dry brushing some of the Pro-Acryl Dark Gray Blue. And I'll kind of have a dark, cool base, which will contrast nicely with the brighter, lighter, warm brown and gray tones of the Werewolf. So just giving the texture a quick, heavy, all-over dry brush with that gray-blue color. We'll follow that up with some of this neutral gray, also from Pro-Acryl, but you could use any sort of gray shades here. Do a quick, less heavy dry brush. Whenever you're dry brushing, I talk about dry brushing a lot, but you generally start heavy, and with each progressive dry brush, go a little lighter. And basing is no different. So just a little bit of a lighter dry brush to pick up the texture of the gravel with the neutral gray. And then once we're done with the neutral gray, we'll lighten it up a little bit just by adding a little white or adding a lighter gray for a final very light highlight. And I finish off the bases with some Army Painter Deadlands Tufts, which are kind of a interesting like yellow, brown, mostly gray, a little bit of black static grass tufts. Just dip those in a little super glue and then drop those kind of scattered about on the bases. And that is it. So hopefully you found that useful. As always, if you have any questions, you can always ask in the comments below. I try to be very quick and responsive to any questions that anybody has. I want these videos to be useful to folks. So if you found it useful, if you found it enjoyable, I always appreciate a like, appreciate a subscribe, a comment, all that good stuff. And we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.